Good evening. Thank you for joining the Dole Institute of Politics for this program this evening. My name is Emily Depew, and I'm a member of the Student Advisory Board, the official student group of the Institute. The Student Advisory Board is a bipartisan group whose members can access many great opportunities through their involvement with the Institute. If you are a student and you would like to join, please contact us at dolesab@ku.edu. After this program, we will have time for questions. If you have a question, please type your question in the chat box on your screen. And now please join me in welcoming the Senior Associate Director of the Dole Institute, Dr. Barbara Ballard, who will moderate the conversation this evening.
Thank you very much, Emily. Appreciate that introduction. Good evening and welcome to the Dole Institute of Politics special live stream event, A Conversation on Race. Tonight's guests are Dr. Roosevelt, known as Rose Barfield, and Cherylyn Harley LeBon. Dr. Barfield is a retired Brigadier General in the United States Army. He was the guest speaker for the Dole Institute Student Advisory Board program in fall 2010 and was the spring 2013 Dole Fellow. Ms. LeBon was the Assistant Administrator for Intergovernmental Affairs for the George W. Bush administration. She was the fall 2017 Dole Fellow. Additional information about our two distinguished guests can be found in the description below this video. Cherylyn and Rose, it is a great pleasure for us to welcome you back, and I want to thank you so very much for joining us this evening.
Thank you.
Minds really can change after all. This was taken from a Lawrence Journal World article on June the 12th, 2020. What we have learned in the past 2 weeks is that minds can change. Just weeks ago, Black Lives Matter was regarded as a fringe movement, a response to a real problem perhaps, but vastly exaggerated one. Today, the slogan emblazons 16th Street in front of the White House. Some information from Politico reports in 2014, after Eric Garner was choked by police in New York, only 33% of Americans believed that Blacks were more likely to be mistreated by police than others. Only 26% of whites thought so. Today, 57% of Americans, including 49% of whites, believe police are more likely to use force against African Americans. President George W. Bush used the term systemic racism, which comports with the views of more than 80% of Americans. Minds really can change after all. I would like to try something this evening with all of our participants. I hope that you will at least give it an opportunity. Whenever I ask our guests a question, I would like to ask you to ask yourself, how would I respond to that question? But respond to the question from your perspective, how you see it. There is no such thing as a good or bad answer, a right or a wrong answer, or a negative or a positive answer. And that's a little unusual because people want to put a label on what it is. We're not going to do that. If we're going to discuss race tonight, we're going to do so from all perspectives. So I hope you will do that. And at the same time, listen to the responses from our special guests this evening. I will start. When I say the name George Floyd, how do you feel? I would like to ask Ms. LeBon first.
When I hear the name George Floyd, the first feeling that comes is sadness, despair, and just a question of why, right? Just confusion. And I ask myself the question, why? Why and how?
Rose?
I get an absolute visceral reaction. It reminds me of the images that were seen when we had peaceful Black marchers marching across the Edmund Pettus Bridge, being beaten and bloodied by state troopers. And it was done on live TV, which is what happened with George. It was done with a level of brazenness that everybody had to ask themselves, why did this have to happen? It fills me with a level of, it's basically a panic-stricken cabal of anger, frustration, mistrust, hopelessness, desperation, fear, but most importantly, pain. And I already know that mere words and just those passive measures are not going to be enough to assuage that pain. And what I like to be able to share with folks is that pain comes in two forms. It's one that hurts, that makes us feel like we're denigrated, makes us feel that we don't have a choice, make us feel that our choice is taken away from us. Then it's that pain that alters behavior so that we can create some space for some dialogue. So from that perspective, I think when I think of George, beyond the pain and the hurt, I also think of him as a catalyst so we can create that space for some dialogue.
Thank you. I want our audience to please know that this is just the beginning of a conversation on race. There is no way tonight we're going to come up with solutions and everything is going to fall into place. It's not going to happen. It's going to be a little at a time, just talking about it, discussing it. But what we decided to do at the Dole Institute was, let's have this conversation. Let us begin. Because as it is now, we ask people to respect each other when they come to the Dole Institute. We ask that they listen to each other and that you have a civil conversation. So please keep in mind, if you're frustrated, you may still be frustrated when you leave. You may not have all your answers, but we hope we would have offered something to you that would have made a difference. It is just the beginning. My first question, and this will go to Rose, and then I would ask Ms. LeBon to comment. Why has Black Lives Matter attracted such a diverse group of supporters at this time? We have seen whites and Blacks and Asians and Indians and Hispanics and everyone, old, new, people on disabilities, they're all turning out, not only in the United States, but they're demonstrating all around the world. Why at this time do you think we have so many people that are involved and making their voices heard?
I think what Black Matter Lives did was not only start that movement, but they also perpetuated it to a point where folks could actually understand it. Folks could relate to it because they were watching it in near time on their TV sets, on their social media things. They were experiencing it in their own neighborhoods. They know those folks who were being shot, killed, and abused, they were friends, they were co-workers, they were wives, they were sisters, and they were of all colors. So they had this connection so that everybody can say, yes, I understand this. Yes, I don't agree with this. Yes, we need to do something about it. And two, it's not a they problem, it's a we problem. So that's how I see it.
Cherylyn?
I agree with Rose that this video that everyone, not only in our country and across the world, could see was so violent and so barbaric that I think everyone could agree that this was an awful thing. And the fact that someone did this to another human being and others watched while it was happening and did nothing, I think also resonated with people around the world, that how could one human being treat another human being like this?
My next question. There has always been differences among humans. Why do you think that race makes such a big difference among people? Cherylyn, would you like to start?
Boy, that's a loaded question, Barbara. I think part of the reason that race distinguishes us is because it's the first thing that you see, right? We may not be able to see that someone likes apples or oranges, or has other differences, or is from one particular country or another. But the first thing you see about someone is the shape of their eyes, the color of their skin. And I think that those associated stereotypes with race then sets the tone of how you engage with that person when you first see them.
Rose?
But let me share some additional information. You know, this country was born and it kind of got transformed on the basis of racism. We never ever truly resolved that issue. Not when during the Civil War. There were moments of agreement, but there became quickly turned into moments of appeasement. And if I don't talk about it, then it's not a problem. And we'll just try to work through it. But it's deeper than that. Racism comes down to, in my mind, just one word. It's intolerance. Intolerance is either learned or it's a practice or it's imitated. You find intolerance because it's of the unknown, the fear of the unknown, the fear that something may cause you harm even though I can't describe it. But how do you get past that intolerance? You can't get past it until you, one, admit that there's a problem. There's an old philosopher said that evil only spreads and only wins when men and women of good will do nothing. And this is what we have to do. We got to stop doing nothing. And to do something part is to address the intolerance piece. Get everybody as close as you can on the same page.
Dr. Barfield, as an advanced leader, what role do you think leaders can play in improving race relations and improving the climate for less conflict and animosity among races?
Well, first thing, the leader has to lead. And I know that's probably a statement that people have heard and they think it means nothing. But being a military officer, lead means a lot. The leader is the one who sets the example. They set the standards. But more importantly, they hold people accountable for those standards. And they're not creating standards by making things up while they sit on the bathroom or while they're shaving. They set those standards by having that dialogue, getting the input, coming up with what are possible optimum solutions to the problem. But more importantly, keep that engagement not only tight, but keep it continuously. And a leader has to be able to set the example. And a leader needs to also show that level of empathy so that they know that at the end, no matter what happens, the leader will help you get through this.
Cherylyn, would you comment on that in terms of leaders and how you think the role they play?
I completely agree with Rose that the dialogue and the actions start from the top. And leaders lead by example. And in this context, the leader has to say, or leaders, and I mean leaders in politics, leaders in business, leaders in military, they have to say that, you know, we're going to strive for diversity, right? And I mean, and this is how I'm using, defining race as in diversity in a very expanded way. And we all, and leaders have to say that we are striving for diversity, a diversity of thought, a diversity of ideologies. And diversity is more than a concept. It's a necessary moral architecture for a changing world. We, the three of us here and our audience, may think that, but the leaders have to articulate that vision. Until we have leaders that articulate that vision across politics, corporate, education, nonprofit, local and state government, then we're not going to get there. So it's a vision that has to be articulated by the leaders.
How did we get to this point right now? How did we get here on race relations?
Are you talking to me or Cheryl?
Well, since she was at it, I was going to have her continue and then I'll come to you.
It's
Go
on
ahead.
you, Cheryl.
Wow. We get, I think originally we got here from the culture of slavery and all that it brought and developed over the years. And how we got to this moment in race relations, again, I think violence towards Blacks have been going on for a long time. It started with slavery. It continued during Reconstruction. We saw Rose sort of told us about, reminded us what happened during the Civil Rights Movement. I think that was the first time that many people in our country and across the world were able to see the violence on television. And now, with technology and cameras, we've been seeing a lot of, not just with Mr. Floyd, but what happened to Eric Garner, what happened in South Carolina, a number of these incidences that have been recorded, thanks to citizens who recorded it on their phone, because if not, we wouldn't have seen it. So now we are here at a point where I also think it came on the heels of 3 months of COVID. People have been sort of quarantined at home, and then we saw this. And as we can see, people said, no more. We've seen enough of this. This can't continue. So I like to think that this time, really, we are going to say no more, and we're going to do something about this, and that we hope something like this doesn't happen again. And I think every time we've seen this, we've said, we hope this doesn't happen again. And that this time we have more than just talk, that we have real reforms so that we don't have this happen again, and that we can put a process and reforms in place so that there is accountability and real retribution that happens when this type of violence takes place.
Rose.
Great, Cherylyn. Absolutely. This starts with history. And this is why we say the word systemic racism, because it occurs continuously and it has been occurring over time, where the disease is that systemic racism. But there is a number of symptoms that made that disease fester and come to the forefront to where it is right now. We're talking the COVID-19 issue gave everybody the opportunity to slow down enough to pay attention to your neighbors, to pay attention to world events, to basically slow down from the rat race, to say, oh God, what is happening in my country? And do I need to pay attention more? The answer is yes. But also poverty. A major issue of the civil rights movement was poverty. It was beyond the segregation piece of it. It was poverty. There were folks beyond African Americans that were starving. So yes, poverty is a symptom. The current unemployment issue is a problem. And there's not a lot of relief in sight. We have underdeveloped neighborhoods where laws have been put in place so that certain major big name outlets will not come in there because they don't meet the zoning requirements, or the neighborhoods don't have the right mix. So you start looking at all of the symptoms, and just a few of them. There's probably 1,000 of those symptoms that gets back to that disease of systemic racism. But more importantly, the part that's never gets addressed very well is because people take it personally. No, saying that there's systemic racism doesn't mean that I am pointing the finger at someone who is non-African American. That's not what we're doing. We're saying you have a group of citizens, and we're all part of a melting pot that's not living that American dream for a number of reasons. So yes, if you take away one thing, folks try to replace it with something else. And it's usually not a great thing that they replace it with. But you can't tell a person who's starving not to go steal something to get something to eat. It is counterintuitive to have that conversation. But I think if we take a look at this nation, and you just remember the premise of our democracy, it has one flaw and it has one truth. And the flaw is we are imperfect, but we can work through it. The truth is that, yes, we may be imperfect, but we can work toward that more perfect union. But it's going to take that dialogue. It's going to take that continuous engagement, and it's going to take all of us, especially the ones who are being, where these racism being directed toward, to come together and one, admit that there is a problem, and then take absolutely concrete steps. No more passive measures. If we continue with passive measures, we will continue along the same path we have right now, where we talk about it and then we ignore it, and then it festers back up. And we may not be able to undo it if we continue along this path.
I will comment on that. I think if we're, we have to do it now. I mean, the time is right. People are right for it. They want to see change, and they're willing to make their voice heard. Because human racist thoughts cannot be controlled, should leaders and institutions adopt a policy that while we cannot control racist thoughts, we should disallow racist statements in organized public situations and institutions? Your thoughts on this, Rose?
Absolutely. Policies has to be put in place so that we have a framework of what is considered to be constructive thoughts, constructive comments. Because if we start with the idea that anybody can say anything they want to at any time, no matter how they feel, then what you're not doing is taking in account how someone else may feel. It is about common courtesy. It is about respect for the other person's views. It's about respect for the other person's perspective. You don't have to agree with them, but you should, at least as a minimum, listen to those thoughts and perspectives. Secondly, you ought to be able to try to understand it. All of that comes down to communications. And then you can come to some level of agreement. Even if you don't totally agree with them, try to be at least a healthy skeptic. That's what I have.
Cherylyn?
Barbara, I'd like to think that people have enough common sense and control, particularly in the workplace, to know what is appropriate behavior and what is appropriate speech and not. But we know that that's just a lot of hope, right? So my only concern is that if we promulgate these rules, are people going to obey them? Because as Rose indicated, people are going to think however they want to think. But again, are we going to be able to control their speech? I don't know. I think people are still going to yell what they want to in the streets, are going to talk to people how they want to. I think the question also is, the question becomes, well, what will be the penalties if someone says something particularly offensive in the workplace? Will someone lose their job? Will politicians lose their jobs? Will leaders lose their jobs? So, I just think there are a lot of unknown factors concerning what those penalties will be, because if someone is going to face losing their job, I bet you they will follow the rules in the workplace. But does that apply to when they're in the Walmart, when they're out at a restaurant? What are the parameters, Barbara, as I guess, are those unknown factors?
And I'll continue with this questioning. Would it be a good idea to require interracial awareness training for all educational and corporate leaders in order to increase their knowledge in handling racial issues at their institution?
You know, Barbara, I think some institutions do already have this type of training. They call it, I think they call it different things, but some are called sensitivity trainings. I think the military has that, Rose. Sensitivity trainings. I know the educational institutions have them. A number of corporations have them. Now, question is, do some of these trainings need to be tweaked? Do they need to happen on a regular basis? Should they happen every quarter? Or are they just for new employees when they're onboarded? What about employees who've been with a corporation for 20 years? Should they have, quarterly training? So again, it's retweaking and repeating is always a good idea, Barbara.
All right, Rose?
Well, yeah, I'm following along with Cherylyn's thoughts here. Yes, we have cultural awareness training, and people put a lot of labels on a lot of things, but I think the intent is to start a dialogue, to get people to talk to each other, to get people to understand each other's differences in terms of how they interpret information, how they interpret certain thoughts, how they view circumstances. And yes, these things are great, but one of the things that doesn't happen very often is that, yes, the leader puts it on the calendar and it makes a mandatory thing for folks to attend. But what I don't see are leaders there leading the discussion or participating in the discussion. It's one thing to say, yes, guys, go ahead and have that cultural awareness training thing and let me know how many people showed up and we will pat each other on the back. And that's nice. But we need that leader there to say, yes, this is important. It's important to me. It should be important to you. And I think it's important to us as an organization so that we can meet our goals. And we'll all want to have a great livelihood. We want to have a work-free environment that's free of harassment, that's free of violence, free of threats. How do we get there? Well, we get there by understanding each other. We get there by not yelling fire in a crowded theater. This is how we get there. You come up with those cultural norms, and those cultural norms can only be made by having the folks who are trying to get things done to create them. The leader can't create those cultural norms. They can help reinforce them. They can help bring the dialogue, but only those folks who interact with each other on a daily basis can create that set of norms. As Cheryl was saying, we're not trying to get people to change who they are. What we're trying to do is to get them to understand that actions and words have consequences. And as long as you wear those, you ought to, as a member of that society or the member of that organization, want to protect your fellow workers, your colleagues, your neighbors, your family.
Now, I would be remiss if I did not ask you questions about police brutality, because that's what we have been reading about and seeing on television, not just recently, but for a very long time. No one is born a racist. It has to be taught on some level. If you listen to the news, it seems like if not every day, every other day, or every third day, another Black man was killed. I hear it way too often. And because of that, we have a special question right now for Dr. Barfield. You are a highly trained military tactician. And with the conflict between police officers and citizens, could you suggest ways to improve police training that will reduce the fatal outcomes when police confront unarmed citizens?
Well, let me just say this. There is plenty of training that's out there right now. The problem is not the training. The problem is the enforcement of the provisions and rules that are in that training. It only takes one person to ignore those rules or make up their own set of rules for that training to be null and void. The supervisor of those police officers need to be out on the streets so they can help, especially if it's a issue that involves either a threat or the possibility of a threat, so they can help defuse the situation. It is difficult job of police officers to enter into a hostile environment, and you can expect them to remain calm. This is why the partner needs to be able to say, hey, guys, this is taking it too far. Or that supervisor on the street's got to be able to say, hey, holster your weapon. We're not trying to, de-escalation is the point. So you have to get people past the emotional point of confrontation in order for this to be solved. And they're not going to do it on their own volition. Someone has to be the voice of reason to intercede. Same thing if other cops cover for other folks doing something wrong. Yes, you don't want to be painted with that same brush. But again, if you stand by and do nothing, then you cannot complain of being painted with that brush. Everybody has to take one, yes, personal responsibility, but we already know that some folks cannot get past the emotion of the moment. So karma has to prevail. So yes, the training is great, but if there's no one there to supervise it and to bring the tensions down and to be that voice of reason, then all the training in the world won't help.
Cherylyn, would you comment on that?
I would love to. So as an ordinary citizen, there's two things I'd like to see. I'd love to see more accountability so that when we have misconduct, it can be addressed appropriately and not have to wait until we see a video, right? I'd like to, put policies in place so that we can avoid these things. Second, completely agree with Rose, de-escalation. And I also like to make the point that I think a lot of members of law enforcement have their own PTSD issues going on. That's been talked about a lot, the type of lives and the stress that law enforcement are under. Let's get them some help too, because think about it. The reasons why we have this misconduct, because perhaps these are cops that should not be put in stressful situations. So it might be a good idea to make sure in the training or however the experts see it, that they get some help too.
When we're talking about brutality and we talk a lot about Black men, we also have seen recently a lot of brutality against Black women. Do you have any comments about that? Cherylyn.
Barbara, I think the same, the training that Rose just talked about. I mean, we need to have members of law enforcement who've had the appropriate training to know how to deal with different types of people in different types of situations so that the first go-to is not violence.
You know, I will make a comment when we talk about police brutality. I have friends and I have colleagues who have said, not all police behave in this manner. We take our job seriously. We're public service. We feel, and we wouldn't hurt our citizens. We are there to help them. And they are appalled that they're being painted with this big brush that maybe they fit in that category.
Yeah.
And in fact, one of my colleagues in the legislature made the comment, I'm a Christian and I would not do that. I care about the people I serve. So when we talk about police brutality, I think we have to look at it in terms of it's some people that do this, not all people. And that's why this conversation, I hope, will be helpful so people will realize that not all police fit in that category. How does inequality affect American democracy? Cherylyn.
Well, when you have inequality, then you have, I mean, we use this phrase often, you have a situation of the haves and the have-nots, right? But that inequality can manifest itself in all facets of society. It manifests itself in education, right? Poor quality education. Poor quality education leads to limited options. That means that you have fewer opportunities to pursue possibly higher education, which then leads to perhaps not an ability to get as great a paying job, which means you may not be living in a certain type of neighborhood. Perhaps you're living in a high crime neighborhood. So when you talk about inequality, it really, it transcends so many different facets of society. And to attack it, Barbara and Rose, you have to attack it from all these different angles. It almost needs to be approached from a very holistic and comprehensive aspect in society.
Rose?
Yes, Cherylyn, I definitely agree. A holistic approach in terms of the goals to address inequality is something that we need to do, but I think because it differs on where you are, where you live, it needs to be targeted. Maybe in a certain community, maybe the unemployment is not the problem. Maybe it's a pay issue. So target that issue. Maybe the issue is housing. We'll target that issue. Well, maybe the issue is education opportunities, or maybe economic development opportunities. Target the issue that's in that neighborhood, that's in that city. There is no one size that's going to fit all with inequality. Yes, we in the federal government and the state government can provide resources and some enforcement of those overall goals, but that local county mayor, those are the ones who have to come out and target those inequalities, because that's where it goes. That's who puts the actions in place. We were talking earlier about policemen. Well, absolutely. What you can't do is send a policeman out there by themselves to deal with a person who has mental issues. So that police needs to be able to call on some social worker to go out there to be the first point of contact. Maybe that's the answer. You can't have a policeman be in charge of everything. They're there to protect and serve, not to handle every social issue that's out there. If you put them in those positions, they're going to come frustrated and they're going to do things that they shouldn't be doing because one, they're not trained to do it, and two, they don't want to do it. But that still goes back to the person in charge. Why would you send a police officer to deal with a mentally ill person? Absolutely the wrong answer. Why would you send a male officer to deal with a pregnant female? Absolutely the wrong answer. Don't try to put a square peg in a round hole. But those are what leaders are supposed to do, to fix and identify those problems and make sure that if there's a round hole, you bring the round hole there to solve the problem, not the square peg.
Okay.
Barbara, can I add something there?
Certainly.
Rose made such a great point. You know, the law enforcement cops, they are not social workers. And, you know, the point is, why can't we have a more efficient use of government resources? And again, put law enforcement in position where they can succeed and where we can have a more efficient use of resources so that when there's a mentally ill person, then whatever resources are best able to address that particular issue, we have that. When we have a domestic minor trafficking situation, you know, these kids who are trafficked don't need to be locked up. They need a social worker who is trained in trauma. When we have, again, as Rose indicated, a pregnant, you know, domestic situation with a pregnant woman, it would be great if we had the appropriate people to show up at that door. I just think so many of these situations could be avoided if, you know, cooler heads could prevail, for lack of a better term.
Makes sense to me. For those of you who may have questions for chat, you may get started with it now. We have one more question, and then we will go to our question and answer period. What advice do you have for someone who has limited contact with individuals who are not of their race, but who wants to become engaged in a dialogue during a time when we are experiencing some degree of social distances, but they would like to be involved? They want to do something. What advice would you have for them, Cheryl?
I'd ask them to listen. Listen and observe. Very simple.
Rose.
Well, Cheryl, I mean, you pretty much said it. You hit it on the head. But with the advent of social media, we're not distant. We can reach out to anyone at any time. We may not be able to physically touch them, but you can have a level of interaction that you can have a dialogue. But you've got to be able to say, hey, let me reach out. Let me first not come with some preconceived notions, even though I may have some, but what I won't do to start this conversation, to express those up front. I will let me hear what you have to say. Bring up the topic. Say, hey, I was thinking about this. What do you think? And let me hear your thoughts first, and then I'll tell you what I think. And then maybe we can come to, again, some level of agreement, even if we agree to disagree. But it's a civil disagreement, not one that's where you're finger pointing and you're accusatory. You know, I have a saying that if you start the conversation off with, look here, whatever, then it ends.
Sure. All right. We are open for question and answer. I don't see anything in the chat column right now, and I'm waiting for that. So meanwhile, I will ask another question. And what hope is there for improving American race relations? Rose?
Say the question again, please.
What hope is there for improving American race relations?
Well, there's always hope. And I think that once we give up the hope part, then nothing will get resolved. Hope is that idea that things can still be fixed. Hope is that idea that, yes, even though I might be mad today, I can get happy tomorrow. Hope is the ability to say, yes, I may disagree with you today, but there may be something tomorrow that I can agree with you on. Hope is that ability to say, I will not be deterred in making sure that I'm doing my part. As a citizen, I'm doing my part as a person. I'm doing my part as my faith to make things better, to treat people with a level of respect and dignity.
All right, Cherylyn?
My mouth, hope, like I am going to continue doing what I need to do and hope that things improve, because the alternative is what? It's not anything I want to consider.
All right. We have questions in our chat group. Why do you think it took so long for young white students and the public at large to care about police brutality? Why have Americans decided to show up for George Floyd when they were silent before? I think you've commented on it. Would you like to add a few more comments, Cherylyn?
Again, I think that the more you see these videos, you have to see that this is just an untenable situation. And again, I think we have commented that people were quarantined for 3 months. They had time to think, they had time to reflect, and then boom, something like this happened. Again, as Rose said, we weren't busy, really. We had more time, and this happened, and we said, you know what, this is not acceptable, and we have to do something about it.
Any further comments, Rose?
I think that the biggest issue is we were able to take a moment, take a pause and say, hey, I can empathize with this. And I can ask myself the question, what if this happened to me? What would I do about it? How would I feel? Because brutality does not know color. Brutality does not know social status. If someone wants to do you harm, none of that will matter. Yes, there are likelihood that if certain races, the tendency for that to happen to them, especially African Americans. But it doesn't alleviate the danger for anyone else. And I think a lot of white kids understood that because, again, they had back friends who they saw go through this.
All right. We have a question from one of our students, student advisory board at the Dole Institute, Kate Kemper. How has the COVID pandemic affected the influence of social justice movement? Rose.
Well, I don't know whether it affects it much, but I think that as a matter of course, it allows people the space to think about it. It allows people the space to do some reflection. As Cherylyn said it very well. Sometimes we're so busy with everything we do, what we don't do is take a moment and reflect on the major issues of the day. We try to do 40,000 things in 1 hour, and we end up doing none of it very well. So these issues came to the forefront, and we would say, well, you know, I never thought about that, or I never heard about that. Well, let me do some digging, because with the advent of what we are with social media and access to the internet, I can pull information up. And I'm not saying that it's good or bad information, but it's enough information to get me to think. It's enough information to get me to ask more questions.
All right. Cherylyn, any further comment?
No, nothing further.
All right. Next question. What does it mean to be an ally? Can we discuss performative allyship?
Well, you know, I think being an ally can take many different forms, and it can mean whatever you want it to be. An ally could be someone who just listens. An ally can be someone who locks arms with you in the struggle. An ally could be someone who provides financial support. An ally can be really how you want to define it between you and that person. It can take many different forms.
Okay. Rose?
Yes, Cherylyn, you hit it right on the head. I'm a professor and I teach leadership. So yes, you did a great job of defining ally.
Wow, Cheryl, boy, you have arrived, Cherylyn.
Now, the second part of that question, performative allyship.
Yes.
Well, that is something that's the actions of that ally. And we call those folks Confederates. These are a set of folks where you have a connection with, and you have a set of shared goals and shared feelings and a shared set of values. And you work together to help address and solve problems not only on that has to do with you and your ally, but also with the greater group.
Another question is, changing 400 plus years of systemic racism seems insurmountable. What are the smaller, achievable first steps that will be most effective to start the change? Go ahead, Rose.
Okay. Well, I think the first thing you got to do is to take a look at those symptoms. Take a look at unemployment. Take a look at the underdeveloped neighborhoods. Take a look at poverty. Take a look at all of those things that are contributing factors that causes people to do things that they would not normally do. But again, it can't be a blanket statement. You have to target that to that specific set of localities, because what African Americans face in Detroit are not the same kinds of issues that they face in Topeka, Kansas. Not those. So you can't tell me that I've got to deal with an underdeveloped neighborhood in this one if I don't have that problem. If my biggest problem is I can't find a job, that's what you have to target those things. Yes, it seems insurmountable if you say you're trying to solve it all in one fell swoop, because you can't. It didn't get created overnight, so it's not going to get solved overnight. But what you can do is to take concrete, very specific, and I'm talking no passive stuff, no passive measures, but very specific actions to address those symptoms. But bring the community in as being part of the solution. Don't dictate. Have a conversation.
Okay, Cherylyn, comments?
I think first of all, I want to agree completely with Rose And also say at first in these particular areas, whether it's Detroit, Topeka, Washington, D.C., you have to first acknowledge that there is a problem. Because if you don't acknowledge that, then, we can't move, we can't progress at all. So acknowledge and then listen. Again, listening is a wonderful thing. And then third, develop strategies to target the issue. So acknowledge, listen, and then develop the strategies once you've assessed what the situation is.
Okay. We have a comment, not necessarily a question, but it says, we do not have racial differences except for looks. We have cultural differences. Any comments on that?
Well, again, this all depends on how you define it. There are folks out there who believe that certain races are less than others. So you may not personally believe that, but there are folks who do believe that. There are folks who believe that females are less than males. That's a gender issue. So yes, it depends on how you define the issue. But yes, at the core of everything, a cultural understanding is what you have to start with. Because if you don't understand the culture, then you don't understand the norms of how folks view the world and their worldview.
Cherylyn?
I would say, again, it's back to the previous question of acknowledge and understand, right? First, there are differences, let's acknowledge them, and then try to understand them.
Okay. Next chat question. We are seeing viral videos of white people calling police on Black people for false reasons. Must be referring to Central Park. These people often lose their jobs. Is this the right thing to do, or do they deserve a chance to change? Cherylyn?
I'm not prepared to answer whether it's right or wrong, but here's what troubles me, is when law enforcement is called and people's lives are in danger or they lose their lives. That is unacceptable, right? So we have to come up, I'm not sure what the solution is, but what we've seen at Central Park, we've also seen incidences, the situation a couple years ago when the woman went to go to her pool, right? And she had her children. And although her life was not threatened, it was an unfortunate situation, right? Unfortunate incident. So we have these incidences where normally Caucasians will call law enforcement, and it's, there's all sorts of problems with it. But what we don't want to see is when people call law enforcement and it puts someone's life in danger. That is untenable. And whether it, yes, I do think it's wrong. I prefer not to see it. And I've seen that individuals have lost their job. But I think that is a decision that that individual's employer has to make, right? I mean, every situation is different. I mean, who am I? I mean, the person doesn't work for me, but I think that's just a case-by-case basis, and it's whatever the rules and the conduct that their particular employer has promulgated, right? So that person, every individual has to make that decision for themselves about what they're going to do and what the ramifications will be in their life. And in these particular cases, their employers felt that this was type of conduct that they didn't condone, and therefore those individuals lost their jobs.
Okay, Rose?
Yes, I think Cheryl hit it on the head, but let me just say this. the employer, that's on them on what they do with their own employees. But I want to address what I consider to be a bigger issue, and that is some level of mitigation. What you don't want to do is to help people not call on 911 or be afraid to call 911. What you need is some level, and I would suggest that some level of mitigation is put in place where those 911 calls are screened by the supervisor so they can decide whether or not it even warrants a police officer to go check it out. Because if you put them in that situation, then all kinds of other things happen. So where is the supervisor of that 911 call center that's screening that say, hey, why are you saying this black man is looking at you? Okay, how is he looking at you? Has he touched you? Has he tried to rob you? That's got to be more than just, hey, because I call 911, I'm going to immediately send a policeman officer out there. It can't be a reflexive proposition. That needs to be some thought that goes into it. Someone's got to be the voice of reason and say, yes, I acknowledge your 911 call, ma'am or sir, but however, we will not be sending a police officer out. If something else occurs, call us back. That's why you have such things at 411, 511 kinds of calls where there are non-emergency issues, where you now send and you have put a social worker on the phone. You send a child protective service person out to deal with that issue. And if it escalates, then you call for some additional police intervention. But it shouldn't be the choice is to immediately call a police officer because everyone picks up the phone and calls.
All right, thank you. What are the best ways we can hold our elected officials accountable to pass laws and make changes at the system and the governmental level? Rose.
How you hold them accountable? Well, that's pretty simple. Go vote. And I'm not talking every 4 years. 75% of the legislators that affect you on a daily basis are at your local, your county, and your state level. Vote for someone who has your best interests at heart. Find out what the issue is. See if they're working and running on issues that are important to you. The government can only provide resources and some overarching guidance. Things are ran at the state, county, and local level. Your taxes is not set by the federal government. They're set by your mayor, your county commissioner. That personal property taxes, you say, is not set by the president. It's not set by the governor. It is set by your county commissioner or your mayor. Those things that affect you every single day. So go vote. Every time there's a vote, go vote. You cannot tell me that you cannot put aside 1, 2, or 3 hours, however long it takes you to get through that line out of 365 days to go vote on something that's important to you, because it costs you no money, just a little bit of your time.
Cherylyn?
Completely agree with Rose. And also to add that, you know, the conversations that people are having now after Mr. Floyd's death, this is really happening at a local level. And, you know, to reiterate Rose's point, things like law enforcement, that's a local issue. If you don't like what you see, then you've got to vote. And not only should you vote, but you should get your neighbors together, your church, your community, whatever way you have of galvanizing people, like we're seeing right now, that's power, right? That's local communities. That's, you know, because it affects your everyday life. And, you know, and I think that's really one of the positive things I've seen is how local communities have come together during this time. And that's what I'd like to see more often, and galvanize people around those local issues where you can make a difference.
Okay. Another chat comment is, we need to move beyond the belief that race is a biological truth. That deep set belief causes all kinds of problems. Comments? Cheryl, I'll start with you.
I'm not sure I understand the question, Barbara. Could you give it to me again?
We need to move beyond the belief that race is a biological truth.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not really sure what they mean by that myself, but
Okay.
it further says that deep set belief causes all kinds of problems. If it's not clear, we can skip it. Rose, do you have a comment on it?
Yeah, I'm not clear either on what the question is. If they're talking about that that there are deeper issues other than the color of someone's skin, well, yes, there are. But this is why you have this conversation, to find out what those cultural norms are, what are people's aspirations. So yes, I if that's the question, yes, you got to address those. But what we can't do is to change the color of our skin. We can't change our ethnicity. It's what it is.
All right. Articulation is great and is needed, but what about application and accountability? Rose?
Well, as I've been saying pretty much this whole time, if you don't create standards and enforce standards, then you have chaos.
Okay. Cherylyn?
I agree. Accountability is key. We can continue to talk. We can continue to promise to bring about change. But if we're not moving in that direction, we're just going to keep having the same conversations.
Okay. I think we have reached pretty much the end of our questions. And I don't have any more. I could make up one, but I won't. And I think we have gone probably long enough at this point, almost 25 minutes on questions. But what I would like to say is our conversation on race. We tried to cover as many questions as we possibly could, but we have to remember this was only the beginning. And I said that when we started. But at this point, before I close, I just want to thank Rose and Cherylyn for spending their evening or part of their evening with us, because they felt a conversation about race was important. And I think your answers, your responses reflected that. And because you were a fellow at the Dole Institute of Politics, and I know how much our students enjoyed both of your sessions, it was a real pleasure for us in our very first conversation to have both of you. So thank you so very, very much. And on behalf of Bill Lacey, director of the Dole Institute of Politics, and myself and the rest of our staff, we would like to say thank you so very much.
Thank you.
Thank
I
you.
will applaud you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Great job, Cherylyn. It's a pleasure to meet you.
All right,
And
hold on.
likewise, Rose.
I'm going to close. I'm going to close. I was trying to figure it out, but hold on. Okay. This was only the beginning, and I sincerely hope we raised questions, confirmed facts, and provided some hope. We need to continue our conversations, including all the races, so that we can learn to appreciate the contributions, the sacrifices, and uniquenesses of the American people. We are American people, not Black people or any other race of people. We are the American people. And that's all our citizens want, is to be an American that's appreciated. And with that, I'm going to close the evening again with a very big thank you to Rose and Cheryl. Have a good evening, and thank you all very much for joining us. And I hope, as you were answering some of these questions, as our guests were, that you remembered it wasn't the right or the wrong answer, the good or bad, or the negative or positive. It was your answer, the same as it was their answer. Thank you so very much. Good night.
Okay, we are off of our stream.